the other kind of main aspect that came out of it is particularly the subject of meat and of dairy production. Because even if you buy a steak and you bring it home and you eat the whole thing, the steak is, I mean, I've just been talking about sandwiches and carrots, but the waste inherent in the meat industry in this country beats all of those by many, many times. So if you look, for example, at household waste in the UK, we waste half as much meat and dairy products by weight as we do bakery products. But if you look at the emissions and the land use, the meat and the dairy is responsible for 4 times more emissions and land use than the bread. So the meat and the dairy waste is so disproportionately large a share of the environmental and social impact of our waste that I think focusing on that particular issue is, people get very heated about this, but you know, meat and dairy in your kitchen, obviously if you waste it, that's one thing, but the production of meat and dairy in Europe now is in itself inherently extremely wasteful. So it used to be the case that if you wanted to raise, say, pigs, you could feed them on food waste. That was turning a wasted resource into a valuable resource, your pork or your bacon or whatever, and that would be meat from waste. And now, of course, it's illegal since 2001 to feed food waste to pigs and chickens, or in fact any livestock. You're not allowed to do it. And this is a really absurd piece of legislation. It's totally unnecessary from an animal health perspective. But now that you can't do it, what you have to feed your livestock on is soya and cereals, which is inherently wasteful. You have all this food which could be eaten by humans, you feed it to an animal, and most of it gets turned into feces and heat and inedible tissue. And I'll come on to that inedible tissue in a second. But there again, you know, is it our fault that these absurd pieces of legislation exist, and that therefore the entire livestock industry of Europe, pretty much with a very, very few tiny exceptions, is unsustainable? And by buying into it, am I individually responsible for that waste? Is it just the same as getting a sandwich and chucking it in the bin? Arguably, yes. I mean, much more controversially, but certainly a lot of the people that were engaged in this blog thought, you know, even if you're not saying be a vegetarian or a vegan, at least, you know, reducing that meat consumption, so you're reducing that strain on resources, is part of not being wasteful yourself. But what you can definitely say, at the very, very least, is that if we're going to produce meat and dairy products in this inherently wasteful way, in this resource-intensive way, the very least we could do is make sure that we eat those animals in their entirety. And that's something that's really shocking in the meat industry today, because about 1/3 to 1/2 of all the animals we kill get chucked out. We don't eat offal in this country anymore. Consumption has halved in the last 20 years. You can still maybe get your lamb's kidneys and the odd bit and bob of offal here and there, but it used to be a central part of our gastronomic traditions to make sure that from the nose to the tail, the animal is consumed. So lungs, testicles, heads, tails, ears, all of these things which in many other parts of the world are consumed with relish and which used to be here in Britain. And now, butchers and slaughterhouses actually pay to incinerate pig heads. When I've raised my pigs on food waste, I boil up my pig head and I turn it into the traditional terrine called brawn. It's wonderful stuff. You boil it for 4 hours, shred all the meat off, pour it into a baking tin, it sets, and it becomes this delicious chunky pate terrine. And one pig head will last me for lunch for 3 weeks. And we're chucking them away, despite the fact that, you know, we've wasted a lot of produce, you know, to make this pig, including its head, and then we're wasting it. So, you know, if you're going to eat meat, one of the individual ways in which you could implement waste reduction is not obviously just by not chucking it away in your bin, but by making sure that that whole animal gets consumed. Go and ask your butcher for some pig's trotters or a tail. You know, now we export most of our pig's trotters to China instead of eating them ourselves. And it's a delicious and very easy way of reducing your own wastefulness. Because, you know, we vote with our pounds, and if we vote for eating pig's trotters and eating pig's heads, we'll make the whole system a lot more efficient and much less wasteful. This is a 4-metre long blood sausage, and it represents just how delicious waste avoidance can be for ourselves. 100,000 tonnes of blood in the UK are wasted every year from slaughterhouses. It's stuffed with protein. Those animals shed it. The very least we could do, surely, is eat it and not just pour it down the drain. And I think everyone's going to have the opportunity on it to take some of it home. Taste how delicious blood is. So when people say, you know, how can I personally reduce my waste? I try and avoid the recipes for vegetable soup and plum stew and the rest of it. Eat blood is a really good way of reducing your own personal waste.